Christopher Hitchens is the most popular and famed atheist ever, to my mind. He is one of the luminaries of the atheist space and has successfully argued against all the different religions and the idea of God as a whole. And he's like Jesus in the atheist's mind, because they've never met him, they've never seen him, but they believe in what he says 100%. Such books as God is Not Great, which contains most of his preliminary arguments against Christianity, they see this equal to a Bible for them. So I thought, let's break down these arguments, because being as I was an atheist for many years, I read all the books like this and I doted over them. Now I'm a Christian, I am best placed to give you the tools to defeat these arguments in the many mouths of the irritating atheists you will meet, such as that Danny guy yesterday. I mean, we already did a video on him this morning. Or yesterday morning. So anyway, let's carry on. We did part 1, his view on how religion and the idea of religion, the belief in a God, is immoral and a delusionary lie, although his evidence didn't stack up because he himself could imagine a God after saying it was impossible, and the God he imagined was evil just like him. So let's move on to part 2. The New Testament exceeds the evil of the Old One. This is another of his proofs that religion is evil, because he supposes that it gets worse over time and has a detrimental effect over time that also gets worse. Let's read. The work of rereading the Old Testament is sometimes tiring, but always necessary, because as one proceeds there to begin to occur some sinister premonitions. Abraham, another ancestor of monotheism, is ready to make a human sacrifice of his own firstborn child. And a rumour comes about that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Gradually these two myths begin to converge, and it's needful to bear in mind when consuming the New Testament gospel, because if you pick up any one of the 4 gospels and read them at random, it will not be long before you learn that such and such an action or saying attributed to Jesus was done so that an ancient prophecy could be fulfilled. Speaking of the arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem, riding astride a donkey, Matthew says in chapter 21 verse 4, all of this was done that it might be fulfilled, that which was spoken by the prophet. And this is probably a reference to Zechariah 9 verse 9, where it is said that when the Messiah comes he will be riding on a donkey. The Jews are still waiting for this arrival, wherever the Christians claim it has already taken place. If it should seem odd that an action should be deliberately performed in order that a foretelling be vindicated, that is because it is odd. And it is necessarily odd because, just like the Old Testament, the new one is also a work of crude carpentry hammered together long after its purported events, and full of improvised attempts to make things correctively come out right. For concision, I shall again defer to a finer writer than myself and quote what H.L. Mencken irrefutably says in his treatise on the gods. So that's quite a long passage. Let's before we go into the treatise that he mentions, let's go through that. So the title, The New Testament Exceeds the Evil of the Old One. We're strawmanning the Old Testament then, because we haven't covered that so far. And as an astute writer, which this man is, he would have to conclude that not everyone who's reading this book is familiar with the Old Testament or has any knowledge of its contents. So to say the New Testament exceeds the evil of the Old One, then start talking about the new one, we've already attached evil to the Old Testament without having read it, which is, I can't remember what it's called when you do that. It might actually be a straw man. Nobody who's reading this book knows what's in the Old Testament, but now they are going to presume that it's evil, and that is the basic foundation of saying that the New Testament is worse, right? Because if the Old Testament's not evil, then the New Testament isn't evil either, because even if it's worse than the Old Testament, if the Old Testament is good, then the New Testament is just slightly less good, and neither one of them has to be evil. So that's the faulty proposition he starts on. Old Testament is evil. We don't know that's true, but he's going to accept that. And now we're going to stack on top of that, the New Testament's actually worse. His first sentence, the work of rereading the Old Testament is sometimes tiring, but always necessary. Finally, we find something we agree on, Hitchens and myself. Now, in the past, I agreed with him 100%, and I just read this without thinking it through. and I agreed with it. That's the only thing I agree with now, that reading the Old Testament is necessary for understanding. Which you would think would be very, very obvious. You know, how can you understand a book full of words if you've never read it, if you have no familiarity with its text? That's like me saying, this book is completely evil without having read it to you. And then saying, well, the book I made's better than this one without you reading this one. It just logically doesn't follow. So anyway, he describes the rereading, so he has read it before, although he's not going to tell us about that. He describes his rereading of the Old Testament as tiring, but also necessary, because one proceeds there to begin to occur some sinister premonitions. So he's saying when you read the Old Testament, you will start coming out with sinister premonitions based on the content of the Old Testament. Now, remember, in chapter 2, he said it's impossible to imagine a vision of the future or a dream, or it's impossible to imagine a God or have faith in such a thing. And he is incapable of it. So he said, imagine you were capable of it. He admits that he isn't, and that he thinks actually you're deluded if you don't agree with him. Now he's saying you can imagine what comes out of those books because he has done it himself. So that's 2 times now where he's falsified his own initial argument. And this is atheists. This is your Messiah. Let me remind you, every single argument you came out with in the last month of debates, and last year I noticed it a lot, all your arguments are ripped off from this guy. Now, this guy did his own thinking. Nobody, whatever they can say about Christopher Hitchens, can claim that Hitchens stole his arguments and didn't think them through to their logical conclusions. Even if he got his answer wrong at the end, the bookwork he did leading up to it, which is in here, is solid, and he did it himself. Kudos to you, Hitchens, wherever your soul may be, for doing that legwork and not leaving it to someone else, or assuming that it was just done. So, to the premonitions which occur, which are sinister. Abraham, another ancestor of monotheism, is ready to make a human sacrifice of his own firstborn. This is something which happens in the Old Testament, where God tests Abraham by saying, put your firstborn son on an altar made of stone, grab a knife and be ready to sacrifice his life for me to prove that you believe in my word. And Abraham does so. Now, he doesn't actually sacrifice his son. God stops him and says, right, the fact that you're willing to do as I command you proves that you are willing to listen to me, and even if the thing I give you to do seems wrong, you will do it anyway because you have faith in God. And then he says, don't sacrifice your son anymore. So Abraham's happy, the son's happy, God's happy, everyone's a winner. And he's going to now make the case that because God did that, God is evil, and the Old Testament's evil because that's at the beginning. A rumour comes that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Gradually these 2 myths begin to converge. So what he's talking about there is saying the myth of Abraham being tasked to sacrifice his own firstborn, and then it not happening, God letting him off the hook, is a convergence with the later myth that a virgin will conceive a son. So he's kind of slyly saying Abraham was supposed to kill his son, but he didn't. The virgin was supposed to conceive, but she really didn't. So he's invalidating the birth of Jesus. But we know, since this book has been written actually, many paleontologists, historians and archaeologists have in fact found that there is more evidence that Jesus Christ existed, even if he was just a regular guy. There is more evidence of his life in official testament from the Roman Empire and other people who travelled around in their recordings than there is that Hitler existed. That's a fact. There is more evidence that Jesus Christ existed than there is that Hitler existed. So we know Jesus Christ, even if he was just a regular guy, did in fact exist, was born in Bethlehem, to a mother called Mary, and the events described in the Bible of his life are loosely based around historical fact. He didn't know that at the time, but now we know his story proves him to be wrong, and Jesus to be correct. In needing to bear this in mind when coming to the Old Testament, because if you pick up any of the 4 Gospels and read them at random, it will not be long before you learn that such and such an action or saying attributed to Jesus was done so that an ancient prophecy should come true. So here he's actually admitting, even though he said Jesus isn't real, he doesn't believe that Jesus was real, Jesus went around speaking things which were then fulfilled in the prophets of old. And that's the reason he did them. So even though he says, God's evil, Jesus isn't real, this stuff's all delusionary nonsense and religious people are deluded and liars, the very basis of the book he's about to tell you is bad is true in his own words. He's the one that said that. Let's go through it. Bear this in mind when coming to the New Testament, because if you pick up any of the 4 Gospels and read them at random, so it's not like particular bits do this and other bits don't. The entire of the 4 Gospel books, if you read them at random, pick any part and it will do this. It will not be long before you learn that such and such an action or saying attributed to Jesus was done so that an ancient prophecy should come true. And we know the prophecies do come true. In fact, he is going to refer to one later in this book, which he didn't realise had come true, but did. And then a second one, which is coming true now in the Middle East. Riding astride a donkey, Matthew says in chapter 21, verse 4, all of this was done that it might be fulfilled, that which was spoken by the prophet. The reference is to Zechariah 9, verse 9, where it said that the Messiah will come in riding on a donkey. The Jews are still waiting for this arrival, and the Christians claim it has already taken place. He's correct. The Jews do argue that this has happened, and the Christians think that this already has taken place. But to say the Jews don't believe in this is actually a logical fallacy as well, because Zechariah, the prophet he mentions and references as the source of that prophecy, was Jewish. And in fact, the Gospels, who he said you could read at random and they would all correctly do this, were also Jewish. So the best he can do is reduce his claim to some Jews don't accept that this has happened, some Jews do accept that this has happened, and the ones he references, the Gospel writers and Zechariah from the Old Testament, and also Abraham, will all profess that this has definitely happened. So 50% of his conclusion straight away is proven to be wrong. If it should seem odd that an action should deliberately be performed in order that a foretelling be vindicated, that is because it is odd, is his supposition. And I suppose in a way he's right. People who predict future events with nothing but the Holy Spirit as their guide, no testament of historical precedent or evidence, may seem odd. And it is. When I have said, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, I just feel like it is, and then it did rain, it doesn't validate me as a person who can get things right when predicting the future. It just validates that particular one was right. But he mentioned the 4 Gospels and said himself, pick any book, any piece at random, and they all do this. So he validated that the Gospels, at least, even if the Gospel writers can be shown to be faulty, the word of God in the Gospels cannot, by his own admission. So his original proposition, the Old Testament's evil, the New Testament's worse, includes, but the New Testament does accurately predict prophecies that are going to happen or have happened. And the Jews which he say deny Jesus actually includes, we have to include, the Jews which don't deny Jesus, i.e. the Gospel writers themselves, Zechariah and the prophets of the Old Testament, and the Messianic Jews of today, and guys like myself, ethnic Jews who became religiously Christian. We believe in Jesus. Then he says, I shall defer to a finer writer than myself, and he quotes Mencken. So, this is the Mencken quote. The simple fact that the New Testament, as we know it, is a helter-skelter accumulation of more or less discordant documents, some of them probably respectable in origin, but others palpably apocryphal, and the most of them, the good along with the bad, show unmistakable signs of having been tampered with. So his between-the-lines assumption here is, because a book is tampered, because a book has had changes over time, language or grammar changes or put into different books and reprinted, this indicates that you cannot trust their contents when it relates to proving or disproving God and religions. Let's have a look at how many times this book has been tampered, shall we? Because it says in the first few pages. God is great. God is not great, sorry, I tripped over myself there. God is not great. Originally printed in 2005. Edited and reprinted in 2007. edited and reprinted in 2008. And that's when I bought this book, 2008. So by the time I had got hold of this book, it had already seen 3 prints, and each one of those prints had seen 3 revisions. So that's 9 editorials of this book in 3 years. So therefore, if we're going to use the argument that this book is true, we also have to say that the gospel is true, because he said himself, randomly selected parts marry up with prophecy, and those prophecies do come true a lot of the time. And we have to say his excuse for saying it's false, editorials over time, changes in grammar and language, would also invalidate this book, which means we throw his entire argument out if we use that logic. So we cannot use that logic, or we have 0 books to work from. We have no gospels and we have no this. I feel quoting Mencken in this case didn't help Hitchens. Although, like I said, atheists will run straight past this without really thinking it through, because they lack that sort of discerning, truthful view of scriptures and books in general. As discerning Christians, we know this is falsifying itself every single time it speaks, and even when it quotes he calls this a more intelligent and more better author than him. When he quotes Mencken, even Mencken's quote contains inaccuracies, a straw man, and invalidates itself. So far we can see this book is finding it very difficult to try and make the Old Testament evil, and without the Old Testament being evil, it cannot say the New Testament is worse, because there is no point of reference. It also trips over the Gospels and Zechariah in trying to say they are not believers of Jesus because they're Jewish, but they are. And therefore Jews and Christians are arguing about this. Finishes up on the proposition that the good along with the bad show unmistakable signs of being tampered with, and this is a reason why we should not believe it. Even though the same thing can be said of this book. So, we move on. Both Payne, another author, and Mencken, who put themselves for different reasons to an honest effort to read the text, have been borne out later by biblical scholarship, much of it first embarked upon to show that the text was still relevant. But this argument takes place over the heads of those whom the good book is all that is required. One recalls the governor of Texas, who, it asked if the Bible should also be taught in Spanish, replied, If English was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for me. Rightly are the simple so called. Now, let's go through that, because there's a slight... I feel like Hitchens is being unfair to the Texas governor here. So let's have a look at why. Payne and Mencken put themselves in the position of reading the Gospels so that they can criticise it, and the argument takes place over the heads of the people who read the book. That's the claim. So Mencken and Payne, who are atheists arguing against the book, they take prominence in terms of understanding to the Christians who believe the book in the eyes of Hitchen. And this is proven out in his example of the Texas governor who is a Christian, because he says, the governor of Texas, not Tesco, the governor of Texas, when asked, do you think the Bible should be taught in Spanish as well as English, replied, if English was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for me. And then he calls him simple. So he is supposing that the governor of Texas thought Jesus, when he was speaking in English, and therefore the Texas governor is simple, and therefore his proposition of reading the Bible in schools must therefore be simple too. But it's a very, very subtle piece of trickery that Hitchens uses, because what the governor of Texas was actually saying is, if Jesus led us to having the King James Bible written in English, which is the most widely distributed version of the scriptural texts, if that was good enough for Jesus to use, then Spanish people moving to America should also learn from the English one. Which I think is totally fair. If you are a teacher in an English-speaking country, in an English-speaking school, and Spanish people move to your country, or Mexicans move to your country, why would you not use the English version to teach them? Because not only are they going to learn about the gospel, their English is going to improve, and their naturalization as a citizen in an English-speaking country also will improve. That's what the real entire statement of the Texas governor contained. But Hitchens would like to mislead you because he doesn't care how he gets to his point and convince you that his point is true. The means always justify the ends, and the ends are always justified. So, he says the governor of Texas made the mistake of thinking Jesus was speaking in English, when this is clearly not the case. And without that, his proposition fails, and we know him to be dishonest. So that means, in 2 whole chapters of this book, every single line, proposition, question and answer that Hitchens gave is either a complete and outright lie, a between the lines assumed lie which puts a lie in your head. He doesn't say it, he plants a lie in your head, you think it. Or he had to call someone simple based on something they said and twist the thing they said to make it simple, to make you believe that his proposition is true. And he also validated the Gospels and Zechariah. Let's not forget that. So, in 2004, a soap opera film about the death of Jesus was produced by an Australian fascist and a ham actor named Mel Gibson. He's talking about the Passion of the Christ. Mr. Gibson adheres to a crackpot and schismatic Catholic set of consisting beliefs, mainly of himself and of his even more thuggish father, and has stated that it's a pity that his own dear wife is going to hell because she does not accept the correct sacraments. This foul doom he calmly describes as a statement from the chair. The doctrine of his own sect is explicitly anti-Semitic, and the movie sought tirelessly to lay blame for the crucifixion upon the Jews. Now he is supposing that a Hollywood dramatisation made by what he calls a thuggish ham actor should also be viewed as an equal truthful statement as the Gospels, which he later validated. So that's another tactic we can look down our nose at from Mr. Hitchens. Rather than representing accurate history by using paleontology or historical accurate sources, or referring to the source text, the Old Testament and the New Testament, he has to run away from those now that he's in part confirmed them, and the Gospels, and the first person he runs to is, by his own acclaim, a thuggish ham actor who is an anti-Semite, brainwashed into the Catholic doctrine, who is willing to damn his own wife and then blame the Jews for Christ. So what he's actually saying there is, the Jews are not responsible for killing Christ. Mel Gibson was wrong to suppose this. And Mel Gibson is wrong to say that his wife is damned to hell through the Catholic faith. But we know, actually, Humble Servant has done an entire catalogue of videos with all these doctrines absolutely pulled apart and explained. Mel Gibson is correct to say the Catholic Church will damn his wife for not doing the sacraments. That is true. But we can't say Mel Gibson has damned his wife like Hitchens has tried to make out. So that's another lie. Hitchens, Mel Gibson, whatever you think of him, the truth is he does not damn his wife to hell. The Catholic Church damn his wife to hell for not being a Catholic. And we can also say, even though his admittedly thuggish, hamly acted film, The Passion of the Christ, tried to blame the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ, we know that it was Pontius Pilate and his Roman soldiers who actually captured Jesus, tried Jesus unfairly, presented a false witness against him, put him to death and crucified him. And we also know Jesus could have prevented this had he wanted to. But since this was one of the prophecies that we heard about earlier that Jesus had spoken of and foretold as his fulfillment, he wanted it. That was part of his plan, to go and be crucified, rise from the dead. And that's what the Gospels and history, well, in part at least history does, will attest to. So, that means now we have 20 different sentences that we've gone through, 4 questions, 2 propositions, 2 referenced authors, and all of them have been proven invalid, incorrect, or lying. So we are no closer to finding the proposition God is not great to be accurate. But what we have learned is that atheists of all shapes and sizes, ages and denominations of atheism, some call themselves agnostic atheists, some call themselves Satanists, LaVeyan Satanists, they now say they're atheists, they all use this guy as a luminary. They all listen to his arguments and they repeat his arguments. And we have found, in conclusion of today's video, none of his arguments can stack up to the most basic criticism. They cannot hold up to any amount of fair scrutiny. And as we saw, Hitchens himself relies upon tricking his audience, misdirecting people who read his books, introducing lies, straw-manning the arguments made by Christians with false information, and he would even go as far as putting words in the mouth of another man he has never met and calling that man simple based on his straw-man version of events, that Jesus was thought to have been speaking in English. But what I want you to take away from this video is, during our reading of this book, we found that even in the words of Hitchens, the four Gospels, even if you read them at random, always back up the version of events which Jesus has proposed, the truth which Christians accept. And Zechariah, which was written way before the birth of Christ, was fulfilled by Christ being crucified, which he also attests as a real thing, even though earlier he tried to say Jesus wasn't a real person. So we can see, in conclusion of this rather long video, Hitchens is not an honest person. His arguments do not hold any water. They fall over at the minimal scrutiny that one could apply. And that means the atheists we see today in our debates and online conversations who are using plagiarized versions of these arguments have no leg to stand on. They don't understand this guy's position. They don't understand where these arguments arise from. And had they done the minimal reading and scrutiny themselves of this book, they would have found those arguments to be false, irrelevant, and faulty. And that's the end of this video. Atheists, please, if you're going to use Hitchens as your Jesus, and you're going to use this as your Bible, please read it first and stop relying on Reddit and ChatGPT to provide you ammunition when you come into discussions with us Christians. Because as we saw last night on Humble Servant with JP, and what we're finding out now, is the ammunition that you are shooting at us is blanks. And we can hear that pop pop all day and stand right up to it, as we well do. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed that and you learned something. God bless you all, and I'll see you lovely people in the next one. Bye now.